You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions at theoptionsinsider.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage, Glenn Thayer.
Well, welcome back from the break, folks. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Jim Burns, partner with our session sponsor, Wilkie Farr and Gallagher.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Burns, partner in the regulatory practice of Wilkie Farr and Gallagher. And it's my distinct honor this morning to introduce our keynote speaker, Commissioner Dawn Stump, who just a few weeks ago concluded her nearly 4 years of service as a commissioner at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Prior to her CFTC tenure, she held senior policy posts at FIA and the New York Stock Exchange. And for much of her earlier career, Commissioner Stump served in senior staff positions on the Senate and House Agricultural Committees. She also is a proud daughter of Texas, having grown up about 7 hours from here in Olton. And go Texas Tech. Commissioner Stump is joined this morning on the stage for a fireside chat by OCC's very own Chief External Relations Officer Julie Bauer, herself a formidable presence in the Washington policy world, having before joining OCC back, I guess, in 2016, spent years in senior posts at FINRA and the Chicago Board of Trade. This promises to be a really great and wide-ranging discussion between two highly respected and knowledgeable professionals who also happen to be very, very good friends. And I'll invite them to come on stage, but as they're coming on stage, I just wanted to say I had the opportunity before coming in today to talk to a former colleague of Commissioner Stump, who happens to be a colleague of mine now, former Chairman Giancarlo of the CFTC. And I said, if you were introducing Commissioner Stump, what would you say? And he had these observations. Dawn Stump has a profound ability to articulate the value proposition of derivatives in terms that are understandable to ordinary Americans. She also brings a terrific focus on the importance of market data to the work of regulation and the need for care and discipline in the collection and handling of it. She brings an appreciation for the unique role of the CFTC in setting international standards for derivatives regulation, and she set the highest bar for collegiality, civility, and domain knowledge as a federal regulator. I can think of no higher coda as you move on to the next stage of your career. It's great to see you both.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. Wow.
Wow. How nice.
That was very nice.
I should leave my job more often and have all these nice things said about me.
People love former regulators, don't they?
Well, and it's so nice to be here without all of my disclaimers that the lawyers and the government tell you you have to say. It will make for a much shorter conversation. I will not have to give you all my disclaimers.
I love it. Regulators Unplugged.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to try to cover a lot of different topics today. Some of the the top issues that are being discussed in D.C., some things that have been hanging around for a while. And then, Dawn, I want you to help give our audience here a little peek behind the curtain in the life of a regulator, in what goes on at a regulatory agency. I think pretty much everyone at this conference has some occasion to either file a proposal with the regulator, get something approved, comment, as was discussed in the last panel, on proposals that are issued that are going to have a real impact on the market. So I think that could be an interesting and useful takeaway for a lot of folks. But I'll put on my readers, not my sunglass readers, which are my new favorite swag item, but my regular ones. And let's start with crypto, because it is the hot topic of the day. And we heard the last panel talk a little bit about this. But when an industry is coming along, like crypto is, and all the offshoots of it, the business is inevitably moving more quickly than the government. And that does lead to, a number of things like the hearings that people were talking about in the last panel, where there are really some good questions being asked, and there's a lot of information gathering at this point, not as much in terms of actual rulemaking being done, but it's certainly being talked about and considered, and there's always questions about the jurisdiction and which agency will have it and which committee in Congress will have it and how will it be split up. So, from your perspective, you were on the Hill and then you were at the agency. What's the vibe like in times like this when something like this is coming up?
Yeah. So this is not unique to crypto. I think that anytime there's something that is novel or interesting or a little bit out of the box, there is a misalignment of priorities between those who develop these products and the federal government. And I say that because those who are developing products, their priority is market participant demand and product development, where a regulator's priority is the safety and soundness of the market. So in theory, those two shouldn't be so far apart. The responsible developer also wants to introduce their product into a safe system and wants to ensure that the product doesn't present obstacles for the safety and soundness of the entire system. And regulators also have an interest in advancing technology and innovation. But perhaps in reality, as you said, because industry is moving so much faster than Washington, so in reality I think we have a situation where the priorities get misaligned, and there is this real need to bridge this gap between potential and skepticism, and that's exactly where we are with crypto. There is oftentimes when the product development moves so far ahead of Washington, the regulator's tendency is to use their enforcement toolbox to try and get into the what might make them more comfortable. And I have to say, when I was at the CFTC, I never really had concerns when we were bringing enforcement cases in the crypto space relative to fraudulent activity. I think that was a very responsible thing for the agency to do. I often struggled when we were bringing enforcement actions with regard to industry oversight, such as when an entity should have been registered with the CFTC to offer the product. Not because I disagree that in some cases those entities should have been registered with the CFTC as a DCM or a DCO or a CEF or an FCM in some instances, but what I struggled with is we had never written any rules that explained how those entities would go about fitting into those regulatory categories, and I thought it was really disingenuous of us to have brought those enforcement actions without regulatory clarity. And in fact, we did see, oftentimes after those enforcement actions were taken or there were settlements made, the defendants in those cases would come to us and say, well, I want to register as XYZ. Well, you don't fit that registration category.
Right.
You fit elements of it, but you don't, you can't possibly comply with all of the principles around those. And so I do think the agencies, both the SEC and the CFTC, should continue to use their enforcement authorities, but they should also design some regulations or guidance around what their expectations are in this space. And Congress will need to be involved. I mean, that's the crossroads we're at right now.
Right.
Congress is hearing from the public that there isn't any regulatory clarity, so Congress will get involved and help the regulators and the industry come to terms with what makes sense. And I think that is the correct answer.
Right.
It's going to be a very slow process. This process is not one that is conducive to the pace at which industry wants to have things in the marketplace. And that is unfortunate, but it will be a slow process. And there's a lot of really interesting considerations specific to crypto. On the futures side, if you're going to develop a futures product or a swaps product, it's probably going to have to be cleared. And so if it's a futures contract, it's definitely going to have to be cleared. So there is this really interesting conversation about the interest of the market participant or the client not wanting intermediation. And when we talk about that, the regulators have to take two things into consideration. One is the client demand, but two, the safety of the infrastructure. The CFTC is an infrastructure regulator, and so they have to make sure that the clearinghouse is going to be able to sustain that. And intermediaries perform two functions in this regard. It's not just helping the client get into the system, it's also maintaining the sustainability of the clearinghouse in the event that there are multiple defaults. And so those are the kinds of conversations that are happening now. Do regulators need to design new regulations around these new disintermediated offerings? Is to market every 30 seconds sufficiently accounting for the fact that maybe we wouldn't have so many defaults? There's all of these different contemplations that have never been part of the traditional conversation that I think regulators need to digest, Congress needs to digest, and then there need to be some guidance put forward as to, and perhaps it's a completely different model than the one we have now for this sort of an offering. I don't know. Some people would often claim that when I talked about this as a commissioner, I was advocating for less regulation. That wasn't it. It may be a different regulation, but at the very least, we owe we owe the marketplace clarity of regulation, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting what you say because the current regulatory structure is built around categories, right, that exist for, historic and current market participants. When something like this comes around, it doesn't fit into the definitions. Do you need new definitions? And how do you distinguish between, it sort of goes, there's been this all through time, I guess. It reminds me of the exchange and ATS.
Right.
Discussion on the security side. Some of your earlier comments were making me think of crowdfunding and crowdfunding portals when those came online. And I remember the first meetings post, I guess it was the Jobs Act, and all the crowdfunding industry came in and sat down with securities lawyers, and it was like a Washington version of My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Like nobody could. What are you talking about? What does that mean? What does that mean? So there are sort of translations that need to happen, I guess is the best way to say it, on both sides, and really talking and educating the policymaking community in Washington is a key part of that, and every industry has to do it, and it's a never-ending assignment, really. You can't expect those in the policymaking arena to understand your industry if you don't take time to help them understand it.
Yeah, absolutely. Education is key.
Yeah. So this is relevant to crypto, but also to other derivatives, certainly to options, the increased retail participation. And I think that has grown also in the futures arena and in the CFTC's purview. And that's quite different, really, than how historically those markets were or what they consisted of. So talk a little bit about how that plays into your thought process as you are considering proposals and putting out regulations.
Yeah, it's absolutely front of mind, and I think it's probably front of mind for all of the commissioners at the CFTC. the SEC has a bit more experience dealing with retail than the CFTC does. I mean, retail has always been present in the markets that we were regulating, but they were certainly the minority. And so when you see an increase of a different type of market participant, I listened to the retail panel, and I think they're spot on. They're perhaps not less sophisticated. They are just different in the way that they interface with the market. And this is particularly relevant when it comes to regulation, because the CFTC's regulatory structure, and I think much of the SEC's regulatory structure, is based upon regulating the infrastructure that supports the delivery of a product. And so we regulate exchanges, we regulate clearinghouses, we regulate intermediaries, and in each one of those places, we plug into a different sort of surveillance. We partner with those folks to help us surveil the market. The retail community, at least in the crypto space, very much wants to eliminate some of those steps because they believe, and perhaps rightfully so, that it would create a more efficient system, a more affordable system, a more accessible system for them. An agency that has designed their entire regulatory structure around an institutional offering has to really give thought to, do we have to redesign? Which pieces have to be redesigned? Because to ensure that customer or investor protections are robust enough, right now, each one of those points is a checkpoint for the regulator to say, here's how we expect the FCM intermediary to handle customer protection, and we interface with them, and they report to us as to how it's going. There's another interesting element to this. As I said, all of our regulations currently are written around a system that is largely designed to service an institutional clientele, at least at the CFTC. So specific to crypto again, we have international standards that say our clearing infrastructure will be supported by the resources we require our clearinghouses to sustain at all times would be able to cover their largest one or two members. Well, your largest one or two member is a very different equation if your largest member is Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan versus your largest two members being two retail market participants. That's a very different number for a clearinghouse to be obligated to hold as just a minimal resource. And so those are the kinds of things that regulators are thinking about. How do we make sure that all of the expectations Congress has given us for the infrastructure are sustainable in a new world where retail is much more prevalent? So there's just, again, I wish there were today answers. There just needs to be a lot more conversation about this on the retail side, and on the regulatory side relative to retail.
Right. You mentioned something there that I want to explore a little further, and that's the international standards. There's been a real uptick in what the international standard-setting bodies have put out. I feel like it's been an increasingly impactful driver of regulation writ large across the industries. We heard the cyber panel this morning talking about how the U.S. is behind Europe, and there's some walls that are put up and containerization required and whatnot. I know you were involved in a lot of those bodies when you were at the CFTC, but share a little bit of your perspective on that and some of the things that you think maybe are good about it and what's not working so well about it.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone who's been brave enough to enter the global marketplace and have offerings in various jurisdictions, because actually having participated in a lot of IOSCO meetings when I was at the CFTC, it's very obvious why that is so challenging. And why is it obvious? Standards seem like a fantastic idea. We need standards, but standards should be flexible. What works in China may not work in the UK. And so we need standards such that we have a baseline, but they need to be flexible, and everyone needs to respect the flexibility. Unfortunately, though, in reality, regulators are human, and regulators in particular are not very flexible because they tend to be pretty type A. I can put myself in that category too. They're a little bit on the perfectionist side. They're a little bit competitive. And so when you develop standards that are designed to provide a baseline, but everyone might not implement them in the same way, then you do have these conversations that are very uncomfortable about, well, I don't know if the way they implement it is sufficient. I'm not certain that the manner in which they have chosen to achieve that standard is suitable enough for us to say that their regulation is equivalent to ours. That's where things get really complicated. And unfortunately, I think the sad part is it has resulted in many instances where we've required entities to register in multiple jurisdictions, and what we've really done there is instead of using the standards and the flexibility and the deference, we've created competing regulatory obligations for those who are offering products in various jurisdictions, which does nothing to advance the goal, which was to ensure that a global offering could be had and could be had in a responsible way. And for example, we have, the United States and Europe has for a very long time had this tension. I keep going back to clearing, but the manner in which we would require clearing collateral calculations. So at the CFTC, the distinctions are gross versus net margining and margin period of risk, 1 day or 2 day. And this has been, I've been in so many conversations with colleagues in other jurisdictions where this comes up, and it's very hard to get past, and who has the best, who did it right. The objective was to ensure the clearinghouse had sufficient margin. It's so frustrating to me. It was frustrating to me when we just couldn't go back to the objective. And we could say, clearinghouse X has this much margin. Your clearinghouse Y has that much margin. We didn't do it the same way, but do they have enough margin to support the system? Where in reality what happened was we required that clearinghouse to put belts and suspenders on and do both of them if they wanted to participate in both jurisdictions. And I think that's really unfortunate, that there should have been an exemptive process in many fronts. But there should have been an exemptive process that was deferential and recognized that we didn't have to do it the same way. It's like my kids tell me about the laundry. Just because you didn't do it your way doesn't mean it's the wrong way. I'm like, okay, so I'll give on the fact that you can put your colors and the dark colors in the wash at the same time, but I'm going to draw the line at the colors and the the whites. I'm just we could have done a better job of being more flexible.
Right.
So
yeah, it's hard, and I think. And to what extent I feel post-financial crisis, the safety and soundness regulators and the market regulators who sort of historically have spoken different languages, back to our theme of translating, I guess, but they've had to work together. And the lines are drawn differently in different jurisdictions as well. Yeah. Does that play into the complication? Or, on the other hand, do you feel like the two types of regulators kind of have a better understanding of each other? Or maybe both?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a better understanding than perhaps there even was when I started at the CFTC. We worked really hard within IOSCO to develop a working group across the FSB and IOSCO for this very reason. Because, the folks who are prudential regulators, systemic risk regulators, I'll say, are mostly focused on the soundness of the system. The market regulators also care about the soundness of the system, but we need the market to function. And all too often there was this conversation about, well, if we don't require XYZ capital, the banks that are systemic are not going to be robust enough to withstand another crisis. Okay, but market regulators were saying if you require the banks to hold that much capital, they're going to stop providing clearing services to all the people we need in the marketplace. Yeah. And there was a lot of talking past each other. More recently, the conversation has been about it started with Brexit, but I think it has definitely become more of a systemic risk issue. In Europe, there have been a lot of conversations about the location of clearinghouses and should they be on the continent, and should those who are clearing and utilizing euro-denominated capital have should the European prudential regulators have some hook into their regulatory oversight? It's a challenging conversation because as a market regulator, we're a little bit agnostic as to we're not agnostic to the type of capital. We are aware that our clearinghouses are holding a lot of different collateral denominations. And so for Europe to suggest that they need to have direct oversight from a prudential perspective to our clearinghouses is a little too many hands on the steering wheel, if I'm honest. That's a really difficult position for us to be in, I think, as the United States. And the location policies, I think, actually work at cross purposes to safety and soundness. That's just my opinion. Many European colleagues disagreed with me on that point. Many of and I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to work with many central bank regulators in Europe while I was at the CFTC, but they do not agree with me on this point. It's their central bank currency, and they believe they should have a role to play, especially in the UK, which is not my battle to fight. The UK and Europe will figure their own situation out. But it certainly has implications for the United States. So I do think things are better. I just think there's always something new that creates tension between those market regulators and the systemic prudential central bank type regulators. So progress is made in communication. There's still obstacles in agendas. So,
yeah. Well, one area that the international standard setters have focused on is ESG. And there's a lot of, obviously, work being done in that area in our country as well right now. So I want to ask you about that more broadly, and then I want to follow up, talk a little bit about some of the things you did at the CFTC on this front.
So there definitely is a lot of conversations being had by standard setters about how to properly validate and measure the E, the S, and the G, because I think in many jurisdictions, there are already disclosure requirements. In the United States, there's a lot of voluntary disclosure going on. There's obviously a proposal out of the SEC for a less than voluntary disclosure proposal. And, regardless of who's driving it, maybe industry's driving it themselves. They want to get to, on the environmental side, they want to voluntarily achieve carbon neutrality. Maybe their investors are driving it. Maybe their financiers are driving it. There's a lot of reasons why we're going down this path. But the bottom line is, until we have reliable metrics to measure and be able to ensure that the standards are, in fact, credible, I think that's where standard setters can help. I think that that is where IOSCO is properly focused, and I think that they're working towards that. I have so much to say on this front. We won't have time today. So I have thoughts about the E, the S, and the G, but I think they're all really important. Given that we have this Gen Z, which is so much younger than me, they're not even millennials. These are 18 to 25-year-olds. But they are going to change the way we do everything. And so much these categories are so important to them. And, whether or not you agree that this is a responsibility of a company or that a company should be moving in this direction, this generation is going to drive that, and it's happening, and we all just need to figure out how to make it better. And in the derivative space, we need a taxonomy that we can plug into contract terms. We're so far behind in just developing a terminology for our contracts and our, we have, I think we are part of the solution. We have products that can help people transition in a way to responsibly manage their risk. It's exciting, and I'm excited about the solutions the derivatives industry is bringing to the table here. But I think we have a lot of different, a lot of people are talking past each other because we haven't arrived at the correct measurements, the correct standard, the correct terms. The taxonomy from top to bottom really does need to be, thought needs to be given to that, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us to spend time working on developing that.
Right. So let's go a little deeper on the S in the ESG. I know that you've been a very vocal advocate for diversity in the industry and beyond. And so talk to the audience a little bit about, your interest there and why you've chosen to speak out and be public on that.
So I did use the platform. You have a platform, I suppose, when you're a commissioner at the CFTC to talk about the importance of diversity. And it really wasn't because I was the only woman at the CFTC. People always ask me that. How was it terrible? Was it hard? Everybody I worked with was amazing. For me, it's really just, if you work in a company, if you work at the CFTC, if you work at any decision-making body, IOSCO, it doesn't matter. You need diversity of opinions. Each of these types of organizations are, at their core, problem-solving entities.
Right.
And I suppose the way we've solved problems for years is fine, where there was a little bit of homogeneous thinking and things advanced the way they always advanced, the same boxes were checked. That's fine. We can do better. We can actually benefit from diverse opinions. It's really hard. It takes a little more time when you have three people with they're bringing different solutions to the table as opposed to three people who tended to think exactly alike. And I'm not trying to stereotype the leaders of yesterday. I know that everyone had brought their own expertise to the table, but for me, the diversity piece is functioning well at this point. I think everyone's realized the why. Why we need more people is just that. Why we need more diversity is to ensure we have diversity of solutions. The inclusion piece is still really lacking. And I worked a lot on this at an agency where there really wasn't a lot of diversity. And then we were making progress on the diversity front, but we were finding that people were really unhappy because they didn't feel as though they could thrive in an environment where there were very deep-rooted ideals about the way things were going to get done. And no one wants to go to work all day and be in a constant, people are constantly resisting what they're saying. So it's hard in an agency like the CFTC. It's hard in a company where, there are a lot of moving pieces and there are a lot of objectives. Right. And so this is additive, but I think it's essential. And there's so much. The inclusion piece, we need a lot of work on the inclusion piece and how we can make people, the talent we're attracting to achieve the diversity of thinking is sustained only if we make it so that they want to be there and they want to contribute. And when they do contribute, it's not dismissed because it's different or unique. I mean, it's like a chicken and egg problem for me.
Right.
You stop raising your hand eventually if every time you raise your hand, someone says, that's just not how we do things here. So
right.
Now the CFTC is very different now. Now they have 4 women and 1 man. So it's like a whole different, it's come full circle. And so I just really think that the inclusion piece is where we all need to focus now. And I did spend a lot of time at the CFTC working on the inclusion piece. And I encourage any of you who have the ability to influence that in your own companies to do so, because I think that's where we are now in advancing this ball.
So. There was some good conversation in the diversity, equity, inclusion panel about that particular topic. I mean, it was sort of attracting but retaining and the cultural components and the importance of mentoring and really sponsoring people and bringing them along and lending some of your voice to some of those folks to make sure that you are fostering that development and that inclusive culture.
Right. And I thought there was really an interesting conversation about why people don't do that. And I have to be honest, I've even faced that myself. I want to help, but I only have so many hours in the day.
Right.
And so I think everyone has an obligation to. We talked at the CFTC about, you guys may already do this, the government's a little behind, but should employees be able to do a 360 review of their managers to talk to them about, I didn't feel as though I was getting that,
Yes.
not mentoring, but career advancement from my supervisor, because supervisors only have so many hours in the day, but we need to make that part of their job. So
Exactly, right. You need to measure it, and you need to, I think, take an honest look at those measurements, and you need to incentivize it, frankly, and motivate toward, your goals in that area, instead of them, we talked about this, have it be sort of off to the side, extra.
Yep.
Right? It needs to be integrated in.
Right.
So,
and something else, sorry, I know we only have limited time. Something
all right.
I get
Go
excited
ahead.
about this. Something else that came up during that panel yesterday was the gap between entry level and managers, and this is in the government too. We attract new talent, but the pathway for advancement is real. There seems to be a roadblock somewhere along the way. So actually, Chairman Benham and I, when he was Commissioner Benham, we worked a lot on trying to set up something called the Pathways program that the government has at the CFTC, where you bring in young talent, but they're guaranteed a position, later on in the at the agency. The problem the government has in advancing that sort of a model, you have to have the FTE vacants. You have to have enough FT headcount. You can't commit to giving someone a job if you don't have the manager position already vacant. You can't say, we think Sam's going to retire in 10 years, so we're going to hire Sally, and she'll eventually... you have to almost have new headcount to make that work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting quagmire.
Yes. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about sort of behind the scenes at the CFTC, and maybe start in current time. Right now, there's a lot of geopolitical unrest going on. Margaret Brennan talked to us about it a lot yesterday. So much. And that's stressful times for a regulator. I know, because there's a lot coming at you and a lot of information you have to take in, and decisions have to be made. So, give us a peek and tell us how that kind of works and how that feels.
So when I was at the CFTC, we had a government shutdown. We had the pandemic, we had Russia-Ukraine, we had cyber intrusions that had huge market impact, and weather events that had huge market impact. And so I feel as though the entire time I was there, I started out saying, volatility's not bad, it's part of why we exist, volatility's fine, but oh my gosh, there was a lot of volatility. And so the constant conversations about, okay, we called all the clearinghouses today, and they have a few folks who are struggling to pay their margin, but we think it's all going to work out fine. So those conversations were happening very, very frequently throughout all of those events. But it was really prevalent, and I think really a little bit uneasy. The most uneasy I ever was when we first started working from home. And we had so much on our regulatory rulemaking agenda. And I don't know if any of you know Heath Tarbert. Heath Tarbert, and I already said I was type A, Heath Tarbert does not veer from the agenda. The agenda was, we are going to do these rulemakings on May 1st. And so when we all left the office, and we were having these conversations all day, every day about everybody's meeting their margin calls. We have a liquidity crisis in XYZ market. People can't get out of their positions in the swap market. They were all really interesting conversations, if only they'd been an academic exercise. And he kept saying, and then we're going to finish the rules on blah, blah, blah. And I remember I called Benham and I said, do you have time to read rulemakings right now? I don't have time to read new rulemakings. And it became a problem of prioritization. There were only, as the person who's responsible for, these were final rules. These were not like, hey, let's put this out, get some comments. These were final rules. And so I will say I felt very overwhelmed at that point, because what was happening in the market was scary. What was happening on the rulemaking front was exciting. That's what I love to do. And when I raised my hand and said I wanted this job, I was excited about that. I love the policy making. And I was saying, I can't do what I love right now because I'm overwhelmed with what the oversight responsibility we have. So I think it's a matter of prioritization. And bless Heath Harbert, much to his unliking, we did push those rules a few months. But and I applaud him for keeping our feet to the fire and saying I'll wait 2 weeks because I'm not going to delay these forever. But I did feel overwhelmed. I will say, when I met with all the new commissioners who just came in, the one thing I said to them, I said, you have got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Because there is the thing no one tells you when you take this job. People think commissioners get up on stage and give speeches, and they have no idea how much time you spend like wringing your hands over an enforcement case. And I did a lot of that. Or, sitting in market surveillance meetings thinking, are we sure everything's going to be okay? You have to be okay being uncomfortable. And you have to be okay being brave about that and saying, I'm going to say something that's really unpopular.
Right.
And nobody in this room may back me up. So there's a lot of uncomfortable days in those roles. And there's a lot of uncomfortable days when you have to say to people that you want to help advance the market. You have to say, we just can't do that right now. There's just too many moving pieces, and we can't do that today. So,
right. And to your earlier comment, you can't staff up for those busy times. You don't have the flexibility to do that. It's not in your control. And I think the other part of being a regulator is, there's no gold stars, right? There's no you're doing too much, you're doing too little, you're going too fast, you're going too slow. And so that's another thing you have to really be okay with to do this job, right?
When Willie calls and says, good job, they call when something's going wrong.
Yes.
And that's okay. You should call when something's going wrong, for sure.
Yes. Yeah. But it's tough. It's tough when none of the calls come in the other way.
Right.
So I want to, at this point, we don't have that much time left, but I want to take it a little bit more personal, and just talk about, you've given, and I personally thank you, and on behalf of everybody here, for giving so many years of your career to public service, both on the Hill and at the agency. And when you think back on it, what is an issue or an accomplishment that you're really proud of, or that was maybe one of your favorite things to work on, or maybe one that you felt you really wished you could have gone further during your time there, or maybe both. Maybe they're the same.
Yeah. So Mike Pivovar told me that I would spend so much time on enforcement work. I never even imagined. So basically, this is how it broke down for me. About 50% of my time was enforcement work, which is all very retrospective. And then there's the forward-looking regulatory rulemaking, which I do love. And then there's the day-to-day, the present market oversight. Mm-hmm. And then there's the piece that no one ever talks about, which is the operation of the agency. And I'm really proud that on the operations of the agency, typically that's the budget. And how do we divide up the money? And do we need to do pay reassessments? But it became very obvious to me early on, and maybe because the Edgar breach was pretty fresh at the time when I came to the CFTC, that the CFTC needed to do a top-to-bottom review of how we were handling the intake and the protection of data. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about this and initiated it's called the Data Protection Initiative. And I was very grateful that all the chairmen who were there while I was there were supportive and let me run with that. It is something I'm very proud of. I don't have time to go into all the things we did, but there's so much more to do. It can't just be like, oh, Commissioner Stump did this Data Protection Initiative. Isn't that nice? We issued 2 press releases. There's a lot more work that needs to be done relative to carrying that through. So there's never the right time to leave. I wish I could have done more in that space, but I am very proud to have highlighted that and had people focus on it, because people go to their jobs every day and they focus on, oh my gosh, I can't let the clearinghouse fail. oh my gosh, I've got to deal with swap data reporting. Oh my goodness, we need to write a rule about position limits. And the whole time they're asking for more and more data to do their job. And then at some point you realize, how exactly are we accessing that? When you do your exam, are you going to OCC to do your exam? Are we bringing that into our system? And then how do we dispose of it? These are technical things that no one really wanted to talk about, but that many people came to the table and helped me do it. So I was very grateful for the teamwork that went into the data protection initiative. So
For sure. I have a couple more questions, but does anybody in the audience have a question? I can't really see because of these lights. All right, you think about it. I'm going to go ahead with my next one. So you worked on Capitol Hill. A couple of your fellow commissioners at the CFTC worked on Capitol Hill at the same time as you, other side of the aisle. Yeah. And I think that shared history really helped fuel a productive working relationship. It speaks a lot to you and your colleagues. But talk about that a little bit. I think, for folks who aren't involved in policymaking discussions, right, there's a lot of yammering at each other from far ends of the spectrum. So talk about the bipartisanship and sort of how you balance that and how it worked.
So I am very proud that I had really good working relationships with, when I started, there were 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats on the commission. I had very good relationships with both of the Democrats. They did happen to be the 2 individuals I had worked with previously, so we came to the job knowing each other and having worked together. But I think what's really important about that is that we don't put each other in boxes. So Washington has this tendency, she's a Republican, she's a female, I'm going to put her in all these boxes, she must support X, Y, Z. Well, that's not true. I am a Republican, and I probably got my job because they were trying to fill one of 3 Republican slots. And I feel like there were some other criteria there. But I didn't always agree with my Republican colleagues on everything, and I didn't always disagree with my Democratic colleagues on everything. And I think at least where Russ and Dan were concerned, Commissioner Berkovitz and Chairman Benham, we listened to each other. I can't tell you how many hours I spent in Dan Berkovitz's office just sort of venting about things, and he would vent back, and then I would say, do you think we could ever come to terms on this? And, well, our approach was, we'll try, and if we can't, we'll walk away and we'll be fine, that we didn't reach some common ground. And there was a particularly contentious rulemaking that had been the subject of a lawsuit, and some very difficult conversations had to be had. And Berkovitz, we knew he was going to vote no on it ultimately, and I was tasked with taking a lead on writing this rule. I still spent a lot of time talking to him because I respected his opinion and listening to what he thought about what I was going to suggest we do. Ultimately, yes, he voted no. I voted yes. And he offered an amendment, and I have to say my Republican colleagues were probably shocked that I supported his amendment. And because I supported it, it passed. And I think they were not happy about it either. But he made things better because he was a good lawyer, and I enjoyed working with him. And he never put me in a box and assumed that I wouldn't be willing to listen to him just because I had this tag that was the Republican tag. It's sort of, I don't know if you guys know that song, Meghan Trainor. It's the name of the song is Excuses. And if you pull up the lyrics, I always would say to these colleagues, I want you to listen to that because don't put me in these boxes. I'm not sure if you know, but that's not I'm not who you think I am, so don't give me the excuse that you can't work with me because you think I am somebody I'm not. Just be you. And I've said that to all of the folks who've come to the CFTC. Don't try to fit a box, because you get the job because you fit certain boxes, but you're independent once you get to an agency like the CFTC or the SEC. You don't have to say no just because the other side said yes.
Right.
I did enjoy my relationships with all of my colleagues, but I had a unique relationship with the 2 Democrats because I think we listened to one another.
Okay, did anybody have a question? Is there one? Okay, yeah. Okay.
Yes, I wish your opinion on the FTX ruling or question
What's your position on the FTX submittal about being an exchange, FCM, and essentially all the above?
Yeah. Well, they own a DCO, so they have. I think that the chairman was right to put out their requested changes to their DCO order for public comment. I've been pretty vocal that I would have preferred that it not be specific to FTX, that I think there are a lot of folks who have contemplated similar offerings and that maybe the CFTC should have sought public input on the concept more generally. The CFTC, when presented with something like that, their objective, what they're tasked with doing is making sure that in this case, the DCO, can fulfill all the core principles. And if they can't fulfill all the core principles, they're going to need exemptions. And so that's what's being debated and discussed. What sort of exemptions are permissible but still comply with what the statute says the CFTC has to do. I don't have an opinion because I actually think it's going to be quite some time before the public input will be helpful to the commission. And I really think that it may result in new rulemaking. Perhaps the answer is dealing with this in the context of just FTX's amended order, but perhaps the solution is writing some rules that are specific to retail, disintermediated clearing offerings. And that is something that I'm certain must be being contemplated at the CFTC right now. What is the right path for doing this sort of thing? I don't have an opinion of the FTX submission per se, but I do think that it's probably not going to move as quickly as the proponents would like for it to.
Thank you.
All right, well, we've run over by a little bit, so I'm not going to ask my last question, but I will say, once again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your public service, and thanks for encouraging the next group of public servants to keep their chins up and, nose to the grindstone.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here.
You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network, the home of the Options Podcast. For more quality options programs, visit theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Select programs are also available via live stream at mixlr.com/options-insider. That's mixlr.com/options-insider. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, stocktwits.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions@theoptionsinsider.com.